The wind off Pamlico Sound came in low that morning, the way it always came in low in early June salt and pine, and the faint diesel breath of a fishing harbor, still half asleep at 5 o'clock. Cora Brennan stood on the splintered planks of the public dock at Hatteras Village, with her father's canvas sea bag slung over one shoulder and $10 folded twice in the front pocket of her jeans. She was 22 years old. She had no home. She had no family who would take her in. She had no savings that belonged to her. And in about 90 minutes on a county clerk's stamp pad in Manteo, she was going to spend that $10 on an abandoned United States Coast Guard life-saving station that nobody else in the world had wanted for 66 years. She did not know yet what was hidden in the signal room at the top of the tower. She did not know yet that behind a bolted iron flag locker on a small wooden shelf that no living person had touched since the last day of September in 1958, there was a leather-bound logbook, a canvas pouch, heavy with gold, and a sealed letter from a man who had stood his last watch on that island when Cora's father was 8 years old. She did not know that what was waiting on that shelf would change her life. She only knew the wind. She only knew the smell of the harbor. She only knew the weight of the sea bag on her shoulder and the way her father's brass ship's clock wrapped in his wool sweater inside the bag ticked against her hip with every step she took. If a story like this means something to you, take a moment now and subscribe to the channel. Tell us in the comments where in the country you are watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, and the men who watch them are often the ones who have stood watches of their own. Now let us begin. Cora Brennan had grown up on the water the way other children grew up on pavement, without thinking about it, without knowing there was any other way to grow up. She was born in a small shingled cottage on the sound side of Hatteras Island, the younger of two daughters of a commercial fisherman named Fergus Brennan, who had run a 36-foot trawler called the Maureen B out of Hatteras Harbor from 1989 until the morning he died. Her mother, a quiet school teacher named Maureen, had taught third grade at Cape Hatteras Elementary for 11 years before she had been killed in a single-vehicle accident on Highway 12 during a nor'easter in February of 2008, when Cora was 6 years old and her older sister Aileen was 9. She had taught Cora when Cora was 10 years old how to keep a ledger, how to write the date in the left column, the species in the second column, the pounds in the third, the price per pound in the fourth, the total in the fifth, the running balance in the sixth. Cora had kept her own practice ledger for 2 years, sitting at the kitchen table beside Nora on the evenings when Fergus was still out on the water, and the kitchen smelled of bread and lamp oil, and the brass polish Nora used on Cormac's old fishing knife every Sunday after church. The practice had taught Cora something more fundamental than bookkeeping. It had taught her that a fishing family survived not by catching the most fish, but by knowing precisely what the fish they caught were worth. Nora Brennan died at home in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in January of 2015. A stroke. She was 68 years old. Fergus had found her when he came in from the harbor at 4:30 in the afternoon. The green ledger had been open on the table beside her. The last entry, written in Nora's careful, even hand earlier that morning, had been 12 pounds of flounder at $4.80 per pound sold to the Hatteras Fish House. Total $57.60. Running balance $14,211.47. Fergus had kept the green ledger on the kitchen shelf for the rest of his life. He had not written in it. He had not closed it. He had simply kept it there, the way a man keeps something on a shelf that he is not ready to put away. Cora was 13 when her grandmother died. She had stood at the back of the small Methodist church in Buxton on the day of the funeral in a black dress that had belonged to her sister Eileen the year before, and she had watched the men of the Hatteras fishing community file past the casket in their khakis and their white pressed shirts and their salt-stained ball caps held at their sides. She had counted them as they passed. She did not know why she was counting them. She had counted 47 men. Her father had stood at the front of the church beside the casket and had not spoken during the service and had not cried. After the burial in the small cemetery behind the church where her mother was also buried, Fergus had put his cap back on and had walked Cora and Eileen to the truck and had said very quietly, looking at neither of them, but at the gravel road in front of the truck, that there was bait to rig at the dock and a tide to make at 4 o'clock the next morning. Eileen had not understood. Aileen had been 16 and had wanted to sit in the cottage all weekend with the curtains drawn. Cora had understood. Cora had been 13 and had understood that her father was telling her in the only way he knew how to tell her that the work was the way through the grief. The work was not the opposite of grief. The work was the boat that carried you across. She had ridden out with him at 4:30 the next morning. The Maureen B had cut a clean white line across the still dark water of Hatteras Harbor in the half hour before sunrise, and Cora had stood beside her father in the wheelhouse and had said nothing for the first 2 hours. She had been 13. She had not known yet that she was learning. By the time Cora was 6, she could coil a dock line properly. The flat spiral, not the figure eight, because Fergus had opinions about figure eights that he expressed by silently uncoiling a figure eight and recoiling it as a flat spiral without looking at whoever had done it wrong, which was a method of correction more devastating than any words he could have used. By the time she was 8, she could read a tide chart and predict within 20 minutes the time of the turn at Oregon Inlet on any given day of the year. By the time she was 12, on a calm September afternoon, in the protected waters of the Sound, with the Maureen B trolling slowly south past Beacon Island in light air, and a high ceiling of soft white cloud, Fergus had stepped out of the wheelhouse without saying anything and had walked back to the stern and had sat down on the engine cover with his arms crossed and his ball cap pulled low over his eyes. And Cora had understood without being told that the helm was hers. She had stood on the worn rubber mat in front of the wheel. Her hands had not quite reached the wheel comfortably yet. She had to stand up on the balls of her feet to see over the dashboard properly. But she had taken the wheel. She had felt the boat under her hands. She had felt the slight pull of the starboard chine as the trawler answered her input. She had brought the Maureen B around in a slow, wide circle all the way through the compass, 360 degrees of careful turning on a flat silver afternoon in September of 2014. When she had finished the circle and brought the boat back onto the original heading, she had looked back over her shoulder at her father. Fergus had not said anything. Fergus had not nodded. Fergus had simply looked at her with an expression that Cora, looking back on it many years later from the wide-covered porch of an abandoned Coast Guard station on a barrier island 9 miles north of Hatteras, would recognize as the specific pride of a father who has just confirmed in his own private mind that his daughter's hands are the right hands for this work. She had not realized at the time that she had been auditioning. She had not realized at the time that she had passed. Fergus had stood up from the engine cover and had walked back to the wheelhouse and had taken the helm again without a word, and they had finished the afternoon's troll without further ceremony. That night at the kitchen table of the cottage on the Sound side, Fergus had eaten his oatmeal at the same hour he ate his oatmeal every night, 4:30 in the afternoon, because a fisherman's day ends in the early afternoon and a fisherman's evening begins at 5 o'clock. He had not mentioned the helm. He had not mentioned the circle. He had asked Cora to pass the salt. Cora had passed him the salt. That was how the Brennans said the things that mattered. Eileen had not been a water person. The two sisters had loved each other across the distance of their different inheritances. They had not always understood each other, but they had loved each other. Cora had stayed. Cora had finished high school at Cape Hatteras Secondary in the spring of 2020. Cora had not gone to college. Cora had gone to work on the Maureen B with her father at the age of 18, the fourth generation of Brennans, to fish commercially out of Hatteras Harbor. The 4 years she had spent on the Maureen B with her father had been the best 4 years of her life. She would not have said so at the time because at the time they had mostly felt like work. Cold mornings, long hours, the sour diesel smell of the engine compartment in August, the ache in her shoulders from hauling the haulback roller for 10 hours straight on a flounder run. The particular boredom of a slow afternoon trolling for king mackerel in a flat calm when the fish were not biting and the radio was playing the same country station out of Norfolk that it had played since 1994. But looking back from 22 and homeless on a public dock in Hatteras Village, Cora understood that those 4 years had been the years in which her father had been for the first time in their long, quiet relationship, not her parent, but her partner. She had met every expectation, every morning, for 4 years. The meeting of those expectations had been the closest thing to a conversation about love that she and her father had ever had. Fergus Brennan had been proud of his younger daughter. Fergus had not said so often because Fergus had been a Brennan, and the Brennans expressed pride by continuing to show up at 4:30 in the morning, which Fergus had done every working day of the last 4 years of his life until the morning in November of 2024, when he had not shown up, because he had not been able to. Because he had died in his sleep in the old recliner in the living room of the cottage on the Sound Side on the 11th of November 2024 at the age of 58. Cora had found him. She had come downstairs at 4:15 in the morning to start the coffee, the way she had come downstairs at 4:15 in the morning for every working morning for the last 4 years. And she had walked into the dim living room with the kitchen light coming on behind her and had seen her father in the recliner. The Weather Channel had still been playing on mute. A radar map of a low-pressure system crossing eastern Tennessee had been moving slowly across the screen. His mug of decaf had been on the side table, half full, cold. He had looked, she would tell people later, like a man who had simply decided not to wake up. Which was probably exactly what had happened. She had stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not know how long. The coffee maker had finished its cycle in the kitchen behind her and had clicked over to the warming plate, and had still she stood. She had not cried. She had not moved. She had not called anyone yet. She had walked across the small living room to the recliner. She had put her hand on her father's hand. His hand had been cool but not cold. He had not been gone long. She had said very quietly in the dim morning light of the living room of the cottage, where 4 generations of Brennans had eaten their suppers and kept their books and oiled their fishing reels on Sunday afternoons. She had said, "Dad." She had said, "Dad, the boat is ready." She had not known why she said it. She had said it the way you say a thing to a person you do not yet believe is gone. Then she had picked up the phone in the kitchen. She had called the volunteer rescue squad. She had given the address. She had hung up. She had poured a mug of coffee for herself out of the pot her father would not be drinking from. She had sat down at the kitchen table where her grandmother's green ledger was still on the shelf untouched, where it had been for 9 years. She had waited for the rescue squad to come. She had not cried until 2 days later, alone in the bathroom of the funeral home in Buxton, with the door locked and the water running in the sink so that no one could hear her. The funeral had been enormous by Hatteras standards. The entire fishing community of the island had come. Men Cora had known her whole life. Men who had fished beside her father for 30 years. Men whose own fathers had fished beside Cormac. Men whose grandfathers had known Todd in the years between the wars, when the Brennan boat had been a wooden-hulled 28-footer and the Hatteras Fish House had paid for bluefish in cash on the dock at the end of every working day. They had come in their khakis and their white shirts and their salt-stained ball caps held at their sides. They had not said much. Fishing men on Hatteras did not say much at funerals. They did not need to. The coming was the thing. The coming was the entire thing. 42 men and 11 women had stood in the small Methodist church in Buxton on the afternoon of the 14th of November 2024, and the silence in that church had been the loudest tribute Cora had ever heard. Eileen had come from Raleigh. Aileen had stayed for 4 days. On the 4th day after the funeral, on a cold gray Tuesday afternoon in mid-November, when the wind off the Sound was rattling the kitchen window in its old wooden frame, Eileen had asked Cora to sit down at the kitchen table. Cora had sat down at the kitchen table. Eileen had set a manila folder on the table between them, a yellow legal pad, a pen, a printout of a spreadsheet, a copy of the deed to the cottage, a copy of the title to the Maureen B., an envelope from the Dare County Tax Assessor's office, an envelope from the bank. Cora had looked at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where her father had eaten his oatmeal every morning at 4:20 for 30 years. The same kitchen table where her grandmother Nora had kept her green ledger every evening after supper for 40 years. The same kitchen table that her great-grandfather Tog, who had come from County Kerry with $11 in his pocket and the knowledge of how to read the water, had bought used in Manteo in 1923 and had carried home on the back of a borrowed wagon. Eileen had said, "Cora, I have to tell you something and you are not going to like it." Cora had said nothing. Cora had listened. Cora had not spoken. Aileen had said that the cottage was going to have to be sold. Aileen had said that the boat was going to have to be sold. Aileen had said that the math required it. She had said it in exactly those words. The math required it. And then Eileen had said the thing that Cora had not been ready to hear. Eileen had said, "I have already spoken with a real estate broker in Nag's Head." Cora had looked up from the kitchen table. Eileen had said, "His name is Whitman Pierce. He is the senior agent at Coastal Banks Realty in Nag's Head. He has agreed to list the cottage at $380,000. He believes it will sell within 60 days at full asking. He has a buyer in mind already, a retired dentist out of Charlotte who has been looking on the Sound site for 2 years." Cora had said, "When did you speak with him?" Aileen had not looked at her. Eileen had said, "I spoke with him on the morning of the day I flew down." Cora had felt the kitchen go very quiet. The wind had still been rattling the window in its frame. The clock above the refrigerator had still been ticking. The propane heater in the corner had still been clicking through its cycle. But the kitchen had gone very quiet inside Cora's ears, the way the world goes quiet when you stand on the bow of a boat in heavy fog, and the only thing you can hear is the sound of your own breathing, because there is nothing else in the world to hear. Cora had said, "Aileen." Eileen had said, "Cora, please listen." Cora had said, "You called a real estate agent from your apartment in Raleigh on the morning that our father had been dead for less than 36 hours. Aileen had not answered. Cora had said, "You came down here with the listing already arranged." Aileen had not answered. Cora had said, "You came down here to tell me what was going to happen." Eileen had not answered. There had been a long silence at the kitchen table. The wind had not stopped. The clock had not stopped. Somewhere far off down the harbor road, a truck horn had sounded once, a long way away. Eileen had finally said the math required it, Cora. Whether I called him on Tuesday or whether I waited until next month, the math was always going to require it. The taxes are real. The mortgage is real. The boat insurance is real. The engine overhaul is real. We do not have the money. We do not have the credit. There is no version of the next 90 days in which we keep the cottage. Cora had said you signed the listing agreement in Raleigh. Eileen had said I signed a preliminary listing agreement, yes. The closing window is 30 days. You have 30 days to remove your personal effects from the cottage. 30 days. The number had landed on the kitchen table between them like a stone. Cora had stood up from the kitchen table. She had walked across the kitchen to the back door. She had put on her father's brown canvas work jacket from the hook beside the door, the one with the broken zipper that he had safety pinned in 2019 and had never gotten around to fixing properly. She had walked out the back door and down the dock behind the cottage to the small private slip where the Maureen B was tied up. The Maureen B had been quiet at the slip in the cold gray November afternoon. Her white painted hull had looked tired. Her wooden cap rail had been weathered to a soft pewter gray. Her name, Maureen B., in faded black block letters on the transom, had been the name of Cora's mother, who had been dead for 16 years that February. Cora had stood on the dock beside the boat for 40 minutes. She had not cried. She had not made any sound at all. She had watched the light go out of the western sky over the sound. The yellow had gone first, then the pale orange, then the rose, then the deep keeper blue that her father had always called keeper blue because he had said it was the color the old Coast Guard keepers had watched for from the towers of the barrier islands across 100 years of standing watch. When the keeper blue had gone and the first stars had come out over the mainland, and Cora had walked back up the dock to the cottage, Aileen had been sitting at the kitchen table where Cora had left her. The manila folder had still been open. The yellow legal pad had still been waiting. Cora had said, "Where am I going to live, Aileen?" Aileen had said, "You can stay with me in Raleigh until you figure something out." Cora had understood in the specific way that a 22-year-old fisherman's daughter understands certain things that she was not going to Raleigh. Cora had never been to Raleigh. Cora had spent her entire life on a 30-mile barrier island where the ocean was on one side and the sound was on the other, and the sky was the whole ceiling, and the nearest Walmart was a 2-hour drive across a bridge. Raleigh was not a place that was going to hold her. Cora had said all right. That was the only thing she had said. The cottage sold in March. Cora had not touched the money. She had decided, walking out of the credit union on that Thursday afternoon, that the money was not hers. That money was the Brennans. 4 generations of mortgage payments and property taxes and slip fees and fuel bills and insurance premiums and gear loans and net repairs compressed into a single wire transfer. It belonged to the family. It did not belong to Cora. Cora was going to hold that money. She was going to hold it the way Nora had taught her to hold the green ledger, with both hands, quietly, without spending it, until she understood what the family would have wanted her to do with it. She would understand eventually, but not yet. The Maureen B sold in April. Cora had asked him on the morning he came back to take delivery whether he intended to rename the boat. Hollis Tunnel had taken off his cap. He had run his hand through his hair, which had been gray on the sides. He had looked at the transom of the Maureen B for a long moment. He had said, "No, ma'am, I would not rename a Brennan boat. That is your mother's name on that transom, is it not?" Cora had said, "Yes, sir, it is." Hollis had said, "I have a Maureen too. My wife of 26 years. I do not believe in renaming a boat. A boat carries her name out into deep water. You change the name and you cut the line. Cora had said thank you. Hollis had put his cap back on. He had said your daddy was a good man, miss. I never met him, but I have known captains who knew him. They all said the same thing. Fergus Brennan was a man who showed up. Cora had stood on the public dock at Hatteras Harbor on the morning of the 3rd of April, 2025, and had watched Hollis Tunnel ease the Maureen B out of the slip for the last time. The diesel had idled cleanly. The hull had cut a slow, careful line through the no-wake zone of the inner harbor. Cora had watched the stern of her father's boat and her grandfather's boat and her great-grandfather's old fishing trade carried forward into a new century of work grow smaller across the harbor until the Maureen B had rounded the eastern jetty and was gone. She had stood on the dock for a long time after the boat was out of sight. She had not cried. She had thought, instead of her father standing in the stern of the Maureen B on a calm September afternoon in 2014, with his arms crossed and his ball cap pulled low, watching his 12-year-old daughter take the helm for the first time. She had thought of his face, the expression that had been on his face, the pride he had not spoken aloud. She had carried that expression with her in the back of her mind every working day of the 4 years that had followed. She was going to keep carrying it. She did not yet know where. She moved into a rented room above the Hatteras Village Fish House in the second week of April. The room was $400 a month. It had a single window that looked out over the cleaning tables and the ice bin and the back loading dock of the fish house. It had a twin bed with a sagging mattress. It had a small electric hot plate and a mini refrigerator and a tiny bathroom with a stand-up shower stall whose floor had been patched with marine epoxy in 2003 and never since. It had no heat. The ceiling fan did not work. The smell of fish came up through the floor every morning at 5 and stayed in the room until 11. It was the only place in Hatteras Village she could afford. She took a job in the same fish house mending nets and trotline gear for $14 an hour. The work was steady. The hours were long. Her hands ached in the evening from the constant pulling of the heavy braided line through the mesh. She slept in her father's wool sweater on the cold nights, the brass ship's clock ticking on the windowsill beside her bed, the canvas sea bag with his ball cap and his folding knife, and his 15 years of tide tables stowed under the bed. She kept the wire transfer untouched in her savings account. She did not call her sister. Her sister did not call her. The Keeper Blue came in over the sound every evening at sunset. Cora watched it from the small window of the rented room above the fish house the way her father had watched it from the wheelhouse of the Maureen B, the way his father Cormac had watched it from the wheelhouse of the wooden-hulled 28-footer that had come before the Maureen B, the way his father Todd had watched it from the cold gray water off the cliffs of County Kerry on the last evening before he had left Ireland in the spring of 1921 and had crossed an ocean to a barrier island he had never seen. 4 generations of Brennans had watched the Keeper Blue come in. Cora was the 5th. She did not yet know that there had been a 6th man in a different uniform watching the same color in the same hour from the top of a square wooden tower on a barrier island 9 miles north for 17 years between 1941 and 1958, and that he had left her something on a small wooden shelf behind a bolted iron locker that she had not yet found. She did not yet know that the 6th man's life was about to reach across 66 years and put its quiet hand on her shoulder. She only knew the Keeper Blue. She only knew the smell of the fish house. She only knew the weight of her father's brass clock on the windowsill ticking through the long, quiet evenings of an April she had not expected to spend alone. She only knew that something in her was waiting. She did not yet know what. The listing came up on a Tuesday evening in the third week of May. She had not been looking for anything in particular. She had been browsing the Dare County website the way other people her age browsed photographs of food they would never cook, property records, tax assessor maps, surplus equipment auctions, old aerial surveys of the barrier islands taken from a county plane in the summer of 2011. She had been browsing because the cottage was gone and the boat was gone, and the only thing she had left of the island her father had taught her to read was the geography of it, and the geography of it was free to look at on a county website. The link had been buried at the bottom of the surplus property page. It had said in plain blue text, abandoned former United States Coast Guard life-saving station, Bodie Spit, Sand Reef, Dare County, asking price $10. Buyer assumes all conveyance fees and access risk. No warranty of structural integrity expressed or implied. Cora had clicked the link. Cora had looked at the photograph for a long time. The station had been vacant for 11 years. The land beneath the station was Dare County, 2¼ acres of barrier dune, accessible only by boat or by a sand road that flooded at high tide twice a day every day of the year, and was impassable in any vehicle smaller than a four-wheel drive truck with high clearance. Asking price $10. Cora had read the listing twice. Then she had read it a third time. Cora had said aloud very quietly to the empty room, she had said $10. The next morning, before her shift at the fish house, she had called the Dare County clerk's office in Manteo from the payphone outside the fish house dock. The payphone had been one of 3 payphones still in operation on Hatteras Island in the spring of 2025. Cora had used it because her cell service in the rented room was unreliable, and she had not wanted to make this particular phone call from a cell phone with a weak signal. The clerk had answered on the third ring. Cora had said, "Mrs. Halligan, my name is Cora Brennan. I am calling about a surplus property listed on the county website. The old Coast Guard life-saving station on Bodie Spit Sand Reef." Mrs. Halligan had said nothing for a moment. Then she had said, "Brennan. Are you Fergus Brennan's youngest?" Cora had said, "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Halligan had said, "I was very sorry to hear about your daddy in November. I sent a card. I do not know if Aileen brought it back to the cottage with the rest of them." Cora had said, "I do not know either, ma'am. I have not seen the cards." Mrs. Halligan had said, "Well, he was a good man." Now, the station. The asking price is $10, and you are required to be present in person at this office to sign the deed of conveyance and to pay the recording fee. The recording fee is $42.50. Cora had said, "Can I bring a cashier's check, Mrs. Halligan?" Mrs. Halligan had said, "You can bring a personal check, Miss Brennan. Your name on it is good in this office." Cora had said, "Thank you, Mrs. Halligan." Mrs. Halligan had said, "Do you want to know what happens after the deed is recorded?" Cora had said, "Yes, ma'am, please." Mrs. Halligan had said, "After the deed is recorded, that station is yours. The county will not maintain it. The county will not insure it. The county will not patrol it. The state will not insure it. The federal government has no remaining interest in the structure. You will be the sole owner of a 114-year-old wood frame Coast Guard station on a barrier island that is accessible only by skiff, and your liability for that station and its grounds will begin at the moment my stamp leaves the deed." Cora had said, "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Halligan had said, "Do you understand that?" Cora had said, "Yes, ma'am, I do." Mrs. Halligan had said very quietly, "When can you come up to Manteo?" Cora had said, "I can come up Saturday morning, ma'am." Mrs. Halligan had said, "I will be in the office at 9. She had hung up the phone. Cora had stood at the payphone outside the fish house dock for another half a minute, the receiver still in her hand, the dial tone humming quietly in her ear. The morning had been overcast. A southwest wind had been moving the small craft on their lines in the harbor. Somewhere across the harbor, a marine diesel had been firing, for the first time a single dry cough, and then a steady rumble as a boat got ready to go out for the morning's troll. Cora had put the receiver back in the cradle. She had walked to her shift. She had not told anyone what she was about to do. She drove up to Manteo on the Saturday morning in the fish house manager's borrowed pickup truck. The drive was about an hour and 40 minutes north on Highway 12 across Pea Island, across the long bridge over Oregon Inlet, north through Nags Head and Kill Devil Hills, and Kitty Hawk west across the Croatan Sound, into the small old town of Manteo on the eastern shore of Roanoke Island. Mrs. Halligan was waiting in the clerk's office. She was 63 years old. She wore reading glasses on a thin silver chain around her neck. She had on a dark blue cardigan over a white blouse and a small enamel pin on the cardigan in the shape of a Coast Guard rescue boat that her late husband had given her in 1989, the year he had retired from the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary after 33 years of part-time service. Mrs. Halligan had taken Cora's check for $42.50. She had taken a second check for $10. She had set both checks on the desk between them. She had opened the deed file. She had reviewed the conveyance language with Cora line by line in the careful, patient manner of a woman who had explained property law to nervous 22-year-olds on the eastern shore of Roanoke Island for 44 years. When Mrs. Halligan had finished the explanation, she had slid the deed across the desk to Cora. Cora had read the deed. She had signed her name on the buyer's line, Cora Brennan, the same way she had signed the green ledger when she had been 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table beside her grandmother on the long, quiet evenings of her childhood. Mrs. Halligan had taken the deed back. She had dated the bottom right corner. She had reached for the heavy iron stamp on her desk, the stamp her predecessor had used since 1972, the stamp that had recorded every property transfer in Dare County for 53 years. Mrs. Halligan had paused with the stamp in her hand. She had looked at Cora over her reading glasses. She had said very quietly, "Miss Brennan." She had said, "Are you sure?" Cora had said, "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Halligan had pressed the stamp. The deed was recorded. The station was hers. She had gotten back to the fish house at 4. She had returned the keys to the borrowed pickup. She had walked down to the dock behind the fish house and had rented a 16-foot aluminum skiff with a 30-horsepower Yamaha for a flat $75 a day from old Mr. Etheridge, who had been renting skiffs out of the Hatteras Village dock since 1987. She had stowed the canvas sea bag in the dry well of the skiff. She had taken the brass ship's clock with her. She had pushed off from the dock at 4:15. The trip up the inside of the barrier island took her 80 minutes. She rounded the southern point of the sand reef at 5:45. The station came into view on the low dune above the Atlantic. It looked exactly like the photograph. The silver shingles, the square wooden signal tower with its missing lantern housing at the top, the wide covered porch on the ocean side, the 3 broken concrete sections of the old boat ramp descending toward the beach, the 2 outbuildings, what had been the boathouse, and what had been the keeper's storage shed half buried in the dune at the north end of the property, the flagpole with no flag. Cora ran the skiff up to the small wooden landing dock on the sound side of the spit. The dock had been replaced in 2007 by a private contractor under a Dare County preservation grant and was the only piece of the property that had been touched by human hands in the last 11 years. The rest of it had been left to the wind and the weather and the slow, patient work of the salt. She tied the skiff off with a flat spiral of line on the cleat, the way her father had taught her when she was 6. She walked up the sand path from the landing to the station. The path was about 120 yards. The path crossed the spine of the spit. To her left, the Sound. To her right, beyond the dune line, the open Atlantic. The wind was light from the southwest. She could hear the breakers on the ocean side. She could hear the faint, quiet lapping of the Sound on her left. She could hear the high, steady hum of the wind moving across the silver shingles of the station as she came up to it. She unlocked the heavy front door with the iron key Mrs. Halligan had given her at the clerk's office that morning. She pushed the door open. She stepped inside. It smelled of dry wood and salt and a very faint trace of old coal soot from the fireplace. It smelled like a building that had not been lived in, but had not been abandoned either. It had been waiting. A narrow staircase against the back wall climbed to the second floor. Cora climbed the staircase. The second floor was the surfmen's bunk room. 6 iron-frame beds along the walls, 3 on each side, the mattresses long since gone. A small head at the back with a porcelain sink and a small porcelain commode and a salt-corroded brass tap. A dormer window on the seaward side. A second narrow ladder against the back wall climbed to the signal room at the top of the tower. Cora climbed the ladder. The signal room was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, square. Wooden floor, wooden walls, windows on all 4 sides, the panes still intact in 3 of the 4 windows. One pane on the eastern side cracked diagonally where a piece of debris had hit it in some storm and had cracked the glass without breaking it through. The brass mounting bracket for the signal lamp was still bolted to the ceiling. The lantern housing above had been carried off in the hurricane of 1996. Against the east wall, bolted to the studs with 4 heavy iron L brackets, stood a tall, narrow iron signal flag locker. The locker was about 5 feet tall and 20 inches wide. The kind of locker the old life-saving service had used to store the international maritime signal flags that the surfmen had flown from the tower halyard to communicate with passing ships in the years before the radio. The locker was painted black. The paint had crackled. The hinges had rusted shut. Cora set her father's canvas sea bag on the wooden floor of the signal room. She knelt down beside the bag. She opened the bag. She took out her father's flat pry bar, the one he had used for prying frozen bilge hatches, and stuck cleat bolts and the occasional barnacle-fused dock line for 30 years. She knelt in front of the iron locker. She set the tip of the pry bar into the seam where the locker door met the locker frame. She put her shoulder behind the bar. The door of the iron locker had not been opened in a very long time. She had to work the bar in 3 different positions before the rust let go. The locker came open with a slow, dry creak that sounded like a sound out of an old film. Inside the locker were 12 folded signal flags. Each flag was on a small brass clip. Each clip was labeled with its flag letter, A through L. The fabric of the flags had gone moth-eaten and faded, but the colors were still legible. International Code Alpha, International Code Bravo, International Code Charlie. The remaining 14 flags M through Z had not been left in the locker. Whoever had closed up the station in 1958 had taken the second half of the alphabet with him. Cora was about to close the locker. She paused. She had been kneeling in front of the iron locker for about a minute and a half. She had been looking at the 12 signal flags. She had not yet in that minute and a half looked at the back wall of the locker itself. She looked now. The back wall of the iron locker was not flush against the beadboard wall behind it. There was a gap. The gap was about 3 inches deep. She could see the gap because the sun coming through the western window of the signal room was hitting the locker at an angle, and the shadow inside the locker was not the shadow of an iron back panel against a wooden wall. It was the shadow of an iron back panel against open air. Cora put her hand into the locker. She reached past the row of folded flags. She put her fingers around the back edge of the iron back panel. She felt the gap. She slid her hand into the gap into the space between the back of the locker and the beadboard wall behind it, and her fingertips touched something that was not iron and was not wood. It was a small wooden shelf. The shelf had been mounted to the wall studs behind the locker. It was about 4 inches deep and 12 inches wide. It was completely invisible from the front of the locker. It could only be accessed by reaching past the signal flags and into the gap behind the back panel. There were 3 objects on the shelf. She lifted the first object out carefully, a leather-bound logbook, heavy, cool to the touch. The leather cover had been treated with neat's foot oil at some point in the last century and had aged to a dark, even brown without cracking. The corners were brass-cornered. The spine was hand-stitched. She lifted the second object, a canvas pouch, about the size of a large grapefruit, tied at the top with a length of dark wax twine. Heavy, heavier than she had expected. It made a small, soft clinking sound when she lifted it. She knew the moment she lifted it what was in the pouch. She did not yet know how much of it. She did not yet know what year. She lifted the third object, a folded letter, heavy cream paper hand-folded, sealed at the open edge with a small flat blob of black tar. The tar had hardened. The paper had yellowed only slightly along the folds. There was no other object on the shelf. Cora carried all 3 objects down the ladder through the bunk room, down the narrow staircase to the heavy wooden table in the old crew quarters at the ground floor. She set the 3 objects on the table in the morning light coming through the narrow seaward windows. She sat down on the bench beside the table. She placed her hands flat on the wood on either side of the 3 objects. She breathed for a moment, then she opened the logbook first. The first page bore the official seal of the United States Life-Saving Service and the handwritten date, June 14, 1911. The handwriting was a tight, even copperplate. The first entry recorded the commissioning of the station and the names of the original keeper and crew. 8 surfmen, 1 keeper. The signal flag inventory complete from A to Z. The boat inventory. The line inventory. The lamp oil inventory. The coal allowance for the first winter. Cora turned the pages slowly. She turned to the last entry. The last entry was dated the 30th of September, 1958. The handwriting was different from the early pages. The handwriting was a careful, slightly forward-slanted hand, the kind of handwriting that a man learned in a Coast Guard correspondence course in the early 1930s and kept for the rest of his life. The entry read, "Station decommissioned today per United States Coast Guard District 5 order. Final watch stood by Keeper W.R. Hennessy Bosun's Mate Chief USCG 0600 to 1800. No vessels in distress. Sea State 2. Wind northeast 8 knots. Clear. This station has saved 341 lives in 47 years of operation. I am the last keeper. Walter R. Hennessy, MC, USCG." Cora read the entry twice. Then she closed the logbook gently. Then she opened the canvas pouch. The gold spilled out onto the table. 28 coins, United States Liberty Double Eagles. $20 gold pieces. She picked one up. Heavy. The weight of it was the specific weight of 7/8 of an ounce of nearly pure gold, a weight she had felt before only once in her life when her grandmother Nora had let her hold a single gold sovereign that had belonged to Tog Brennan and that had been carried in the inside pocket of his wool coat across the Atlantic in 1921. She would learn later, looking up the coins online from the rented room above the fish house, that the 28 Liberty Double Eagles in the canvas pouch on the table in front of her were collectively worth at the May 2025 spot price for gold and the numismatic premium for circulated pre-1933 American gold approximately $58,000. She did not yet know that. She only knew the weight in her hand. She set the coin down carefully on the table beside the others. She opened the letter last. The tar seal cracked away cleanly along the fold of the cream paper. She unfolded the letter. There were 2 pages written on both sides. The handwriting was the same careful forward slanted hand of the final logbook entry. The ink was a dark blue-black that had not faded. The paper had the faint, dry smell of old cotton fiber and a trace of pipe tobacco. She read the letter slowly. She read, "To whoever finds this. My name is Walter R. Hennessy. I have served as keeper of this station from June of 1941 until today, the 30th of September, 1958. I am 51 years old. Tomorrow I will close this station and transfer to a desk posting at the Coast Guard District Office in Elizabeth City that I do not want and will not enjoy. I have kept this station through 17 years. That included the war during which we patrolled this beach for German submarines every night in all weathers, and the hurricanes of 1944 and 1954, and 341 rescues of fishermen and sailors and pleasure boaters, and 1 child on a rubber raft who had drifted 2 miles offshore from a beach in Nag's Head, and who was, when we reached him, singing a song about a whale. The gold in this pouch is what I have saved from my Coast Guard salary across 17 years. I did not trust banks after what happened to my father's savings in the panic of 1933. I hid the coins behind this signal flag locker because the locker is bolted to the wall studs with iron brackets, and no person who does not know the station intimately would think to reach behind it. The logbook belongs to the station, and I cannot bring myself to surrender it to the district office in Elizabeth City, where it will be filed in a metal cabinet and forgotten. I do not know who will find this shelf. I hope it is a person who knows the water. I hope it is a person who has stood a watch. I hope it is a person who understands that a life-saving station is not a building. A life-saving station is a promise that someone is paying attention. If you are that person, then this station is yours now. Keep the light. Walter R. Hennessy, Boatswain's Mate, Chief, United States Coast Guard, the 30th of September, 1958. Cora set the letter on the heavy wooden table. She put both hands flat on the wood on either side of the letter. She lowered her head. She cried for about 2 minutes. She cried alone in the old crew quarters of the life-saving station, with the morning sun coming through the narrow seaward windows, and the sound of the Atlantic on the beach below, and the wind moving in the silver shingles overhead. She did not apologize to anyone for the crying. There was no one to apologize to. Cora had understood, listening to the story, that crying was not the opposite of working. Crying was just a thing that happened on the way to the next job. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She picked up the letter. She read it a second time. She read it a third time. She said aloud to the empty station, to the brick fireplace at the south end of the room, to the morning light on the worn pine floor, to the silver shingles overhead, to the man who had written the letter 66 years before her, and had sealed it with a fingernail of black tar, and had walked down the steps of the tower, and had closed the heavy front door behind him for the last time. She said, "Thank you, Chief Hennessy." She said, "I will keep the light." She rebuilt the station across the patient months of June and July and August. She slept the first nights at the station on a folding cot she had hauled across in the skiff. She brought tools from the fish house. She brought a sledgehammer for the broken outbuilding wall, a hand plane for the swollen front door, a brass-bristled brush for the chimney, a portable propane cook stove, a battery-powered work lamp, a 4-gallon water jug she filled at the public dock at Hatteras every other morning. She brought her father's tool roll. She brought her father's brass ship's clock. The first major task was the south chimney. The salt air had eroded the brick mortar joints to a depth of nearly an inch on the ocean-facing side. The top 4 courses of brick had begun to lean outward in a way that would not survive another hurricane season. Cora sought out a retired stonemason in Rodanthe named Albright Sherrill, who was 78 years old and had maintained the brickwork on the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse for 20 years between 1979 and 1999, and who had then maintained the brickwork on the Bowdy Island Lighthouse for 9 more years after that, until his hands had begun to give him trouble in 2008. Mr. Sherrill could no longer do brickwork himself, but he could teach. Cora drove up to Rodanthe on a Saturday morning in early July and sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours while he wrote out on a yellow legal pad, in the hand of a man who had set 10,000 bricks straight in his life, the exact specifications for a Type N Portland lime mortar mix suitable for repointing salt-eroded brick on the seaward face of an Outer Banks chimney. He had her copy down the proportions twice. He had her read them back to him. He had her draw the diagonal striking pattern of the joint finish so that he could correct her angle with a pencil stub. He gave her, as she was leaving, a salt-pitted pointing trowel that had belonged to his own father, who had been a stonemason in Bath, North Carolina in the 1930s. "Mr. Sherrill," said Miss Brennan, "he said my father gave me this trowel in 1958, the same year your station was decommissioned. I have used it for 67 years. It is time it went back to the ocean. He said I expect you to use it well." Cora repointed the south chimney across 3 weeks in late July, working from a wooden scaffold she had built against the south wall of the station out of dimensional lumber she had ferried across the Sound in 3 trips on the rented skiff. She worked in the early morning before the heat. She worked in the late afternoon when the shadow of the tower fell across the south wall. She did not rush. She mixed her mortar in small batches. She struck each joint at the diagonal Mr. Sherrill had drawn for her. By the 18th of August, she had finished the chimney. She converted the second floor of the station into a small one-room apartment. She kept the ground floor crew quarters exactly as she had found it. The heavy wooden table, the beadboard walls, the brick fireplace, the cast iron coat hooks, the 2 sound chairs at the table, and the 4 broken chairs in the corner waiting to be repaired in some future season when she had time. She placed her father's brass ship's clock on the mantel above the fireplace. The clock kept time. It still kept time. Togg's pocket sovereign she did not have. Cormac's old pocket knife she did. She set the knife on the mantel beside the clock. The logbook she placed on the heavy wooden table at the center of the room. The letter from Walter R. Hennessy she folded back along his original folds and placed inside the front cover of the logbook. She would understand eventually, but not yet. The first storm came on the night of the 19th of August. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the eye of Tropical Storm Hadley was 60 miles south-southeast of Cape Hatteras and was projected to pass within 15 miles of Bodie Spit Sand Reef at approximately 3 in the morning. Cora was alone on the island. The Coast Guard had not called her. The Coast Guard had not had a phone number for her. She had not yet, at that point in her residency on the station, registered her cell phone with the Dare County Emergency Notification System because she had not yet registered the station as a residential address. The station had no electrical service. The station had no telephone service. The station had a small marine VHF radio that Cora had brought across in the skiff in early July and had wired to a 12-volt deep-cycle marine battery she charged off a portable solar panel on the roof of the boathouse. She was listening to the Marine Vive HF at 6:15 on the evening of the 19th of August when the Coast Guard Auxiliary out of Oregon Inlet came on Channel 16 and issued the small craft advisory upgrade. She heard the upgrade. She understood what the upgrade meant. She understood that she was going to be alone on a barrier island in a tropical storm in approximately 9 hours. She went down to the landing dock. She pulled the rented skiff up the sand path with a length of 3/4-inch line she had run through the bow eye, hauling the boat 50 yards inland and tying it off to the iron ring on the foundation of the boathouse. She went into the station. She closed the storm shutters on the seaward windows. She wedged the front door tight with a length of 2x4. She brought the canvas sea bag up to the second floor and laid out her father's wool sweater and her work boots and her foul weather jacket beside the cot. She wrapped the logbook and the canvas pouch of gold and the letter from Walter R. Hennessy in 3 layers of oilcloth she had brought from the fish house and placed them in the deepest interior cavity of the brick hearth behind the iron fire dog in a place that would not flood and would not blow out and would not be reached by anything short of the complete structural failure of the south wall of the station. She brought her father's brass ship's clock down from the mantel. She wound it. She set it on the table beside the marine VHF. She sat down at the table. She waited. The first edge of the storm came in at 10 in the evening. The wind began to rise in the silver shingles overhead. The shutters began to chatter quietly in their old iron hinges. The Atlantic, which she could not see through the closed shutters, began to make a different sound. Not the steady breaker rhythm of an ordinary night. A heavier rhythm, a longer interval between the breaks, a deeper note in the underwater bass of the surf. At 11:40, the Marine VHF on the table came alive. A man's voice, steady but tight. He said, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is the fishing vessel Stray Cat, approximately 3 nautical miles east of Bodie Spit Sand Reef. We have lost main engine. We have lost auxiliary. We are taking on water. 2 persons on board, father and son. We are anchored, but the anchor is dragging. Repeat, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." The voice gave a position. Cora wrote the position on the inside cover of the logbook. She picked up the handset. She pressed the transmit key. She said, "Stray Cat, this is Shore Station Bodie Spit Sand Reef. I have your position." "Hold on." She let the key go. She sat at the table for 2 seconds. Then she stood up. She put on her father's foul weather jacket. She put on her work boots. She picked up the canvas sea bag. She picked up the brass ship's clock. She walked out into the rising wind and the slanting rain, and the storm closed over the station behind her, and the watch she had been waiting to stand had begun. The wind off the Atlantic at midnight was 42 miles an hour and rising. She had pulled the rented 16-foot skiff back down the sand path to the landing dock. She was not going out into the open Atlantic in the skiff. The skiff would not survive 90 seconds in the open Atlantic in a tropical storm. The skiff had a 16-foot aluminum hull and a 30-horsepower outboard and a cockpit floor that would swamp at the first 8-foot breaker and fill the boat in under a minute. She had grown up on the water. She knew exactly what a 16-foot skiff could do and what a 16-foot skiff could not do. What the skiff could do was run the inside of the spit. Cora had pulled the official Dare County chart of the Bodie Spit Sand Reef out of the canvas sea bag at the table in the crew quarters 30 minutes before. She had laid the chart flat on the table in the work lamplight. She had read the position the man on the stray cat had given her over the Marine VHF, and she had marked the position on the chart with the tip of her father's folding knife. 3 nautical miles east of the station, in a tropical storm, with the eye still 70 miles south-southeast. But the position was not in 3 miles of straight open Atlantic. The position was 3 miles east of the station, not 3 miles east of the spit. The spit ran north-northeast for 2 miles before it ended in a broken sandbar that curved east and then southeast around what was left of an old inlet that the hurricane of 1933 had cut, and that the longshore drift had been quietly closing for 92 years. Behind the curve of the bar in the lee of the closing inlet, there was a stretch of protected water about 600 yards long at the chart marked as Brennan Cove. It was not named for her family. It was named for a different Brennan, a Coast Guard surfman, who had drowned in a rescue off this spit in March of 1923. Cora had not known that yet. She would not know it for another 4 months when she would find the surfman's name on the United States Coast Guard memorial list at the Heritage Foundation office in Elizabeth City. She could not pull the stray cat off the position, but she could see this position. She could give the position to the Coast Guard auxiliary boat out of Oregon Inlet over the Marine VHF on a stronger relay than the stray cat could put out from a swamped wheelhouse on a dragging anchor. She could be the eyes that the Coast Guard rescue vessel did not have, because the Coast Guard rescue vessel was 45 minutes out from the inlet station and would not be on scene before 1:30 at the earliest. She could stand the watch. She climbed into the skiff. She started the Yamaha. The engine fired clean on the second pull. She put the running lights on. She set the throttle to a quarter and idled out from the landing into the dark sound water. She picked up the handset of the handheld VHF. She pressed the transmit key. She said, "Stray Cat, this is Shore Station Bodie Spit Sand Reef. I have your position. I am moving to a closer relay point. Coast Guard Auxiliary out of Oregon Inlet has been notified and is en route. Stay on channel 16. Pump if you can. Do not abandon the vessel unless she is foundering. I will be back on this channel in 12 minutes." She let the key go. A different voice came back on the channel. Not the man's voice from before, a boy's voice, maybe 15. The voice said, "Copy that, Shore Station. My dad is at the bilge. I'm on the radio. The anchor is still dragging. We have rolled twice. The water in the cabin is past the second step." Cora did not let the boy's voice rest in her ear too long. She had heard her father say once on the Marine VHF on a January morning in 2019, when a charter captain out of Hatteras had radioed in with a fuel line failure off Diamond Shoals, that the worst thing you could do on a rescue radio was let the fear in the other person's voice get into your own voice. The man at the other end of the radio needed to hear on the third sentence and the fourth sentence and every sentence after that a voice that was not afraid. Even if you were afraid, especially if you were afraid. Her father had been a quiet man. He had been the steadiest voice on the Hatteras 5 HF for 30 years. Cora pressed the transmit key. She said, "Copy that. Tell your dad to keep pumping. I am 12 minutes out from a position where I can see you. The Coast Guard is 45 minutes out from the inlet. We are coming. Stay on the radio." She let the key go. She set the throttle to 3/4. The skiff lifted onto a half plane and ran north up the inside of the spit, the wake breaking white in the lee of the dune line, the wind on her port quarter, the rain coming hard against her face under the brim of her father's old wool watch cap. Cora could not see the spit beside her. The spit was a black wall against the slightly less black sky. She ran the inside line by the feel of the chop on the hull and the running lights of the channel marker buoys she could pick out at intervals through the slanting rain. She ran the 2 miles in 11 minutes. At 12:38, she came up to the broken sandbar at the north end of the spit. She throttled back. She stood up at the helm. She put the searchlight in her left hand and the throttle in her right and watched the chop shift as the dropping tide drew through the closing inlet on the slack she had calculated from her father's tide tables. The slack came at 12:41, 2 minutes ahead of her father's table. She did not stop to wonder why. She cut the skiff across the inlet at the slack. The skiff cleared the bar. The water on the seaward side of the bar was different water. The chop was steeper. The interval was shorter. The wind in her face was harder by a full quarter. She came down off the half plane into a cautious idle and brought the bow north-northeast at a walking pace, the searchlight tracking the surface of Brennan Cove ahead of her in a long white arc through the slanting rain. She saw the stray cat at 12:46. Cora pressed the transmit key on the handheld. She said, "Stray cat, I have you visually. Repeat, I have you visually. You are 200 yards east-northeast of my position. I am in a 16-foot skiff in the lee of the bar." The boy's voice came back, closer now. She could hear the relief in it without the boy meaning to put the relief in it. He said, "Copy that. We see your light." Cora said, "What is your name, son?" There was a pause. The boy said, "My name is Jubal Lefebvre. I am 15. My dad is Otis Lefebvre." Cora said, "Where do you live, Jubal?" The boy said, "Engelhard. We came out of Engelhard at 5 this morning for Cobia. The wind shifted at noon and we tried to run for Hatteras and the engines went down at 6. Cora said, "Copy that. Coast Guard Auxiliary out of Oregon Inlet is now 28 minutes out. I am holding station in the cove and I have your visual. I will not lose your visual. Tell your dad I have his boat." She let the key go. She stood up at the helm of the skiff in the slanting rain, and she held the searchlight on the white hull of the stray cat, and she did not let the searchlight off the boat for the next 24 minutes. Cora ran behind the tow at 100-yard separation. Cora did not get out of the skiff. She ran the skiff back south down the sound at first light, with the wind off her starboard quarter and the storm continuing to track north well offshore, and the rain easing into a steady gray drizzle as the Eye of Hadley made its closest approach to Cape Hatteras at 4:38 in the morning at a distance of 14 nautical miles to the east. She got back to the station at 6:12. She tied off the skiff at the landing dock with a flat spiral of line on the cleat, the way her father had taught her when she was 6. She walked up the sand path to the station. She unwedged the front door. She stepped inside. The crew quarters had held. The brick fireplace had held. The hearth had not flooded. The oilcloth bundle at the back of the fire dog was dry. She lifted the bundle out. She unwrapped the 3 layers. The leather of the logbook was dry. The canvas of the gold pouch was dry. The cream paper of Walter R. Hennessy's letter was dry. She set the 3 objects back on the heavy wooden table. She sat down on the bench beside the table. She put both hands flat on the wood on either side of the 3 objects. She did not cry this time. She sat for a long time. She was 23 years old in the second week of August. She had turned 23 on the 11th, 8 days before the storm. She had not told anyone it was her birthday. She had spent the day repointing the last 6 joints at the top of the south chimney with the salt-pitted pointing trowel that Albright Sherrill had given her in Rodanthe 6 weeks before. She was 23, and she had stood her first watch. She would stand the next one too. She did not yet know what the next one would be. She would find out 3 days later. The Coastal Heritage Resorts letter arrived at the post office box she had rented at the Hatteras Village Post Office on the morning of the 23rd of August. The letter was on cream-colored letterhead. The letterhead bore the company logo, a stylized lighthouse silhouette over the words Coastal Heritage Resorts, LLC, Charlotte, North Carolina. The signature line at the bottom of the letter read, "With regards, Penmount J. Whitfield, Senior Vice President for Acquisitions." The letter offered Cora $850,000 for the station and the 2¼ acres of barrier dune surrounding it. The letter offered $850,000 cash at closing. The letter offered to close in 30 days. The letter did not say what would happen to Cora's access to the sand road if there was not a successful closing on the station property. The letter did not need to. Cora read the letter 3 times. She set the letter on the heavy wooden table at the center of the crew quarters of the station. She placed it beside the leather-bound logbook. She did not call Coastal Heritage Resorts. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call her sister. She sat on the wide covered porch on the ocean side of the station for the rest of that afternoon and watched the surface of the Atlantic in the slow wash of an August afternoon after a storm. She watched the long, oily roll of a swell that was still finishing its travel from the western edge of Hadley's outer windfield 3 days east. She watched a pod of bottlenose dolphins working a bait ball half a mile off the second sandbar at 4 in the afternoon. Fergus had not sold the slip. The developer had moved on the next year to a property in Manteo. Cora was 23 years old now. She was standing on the same porch where Walter R. Hennessy had stood for 17 years between 1941 and 1958. She was looking at the same Atlantic that Walter R. Hennessy had looked at for 6,422 evenings of his working life. She was looking at the same swell, the same dolphin pod, the same long, oily roll of an August afternoon. She was not going to sell the station. She did not yet know how she was going to keep the station. She was going to find out. Eileen called her on the morning of the 28th of August. Cora was at the public dock at Hatteras Village picking up her weekly fresh water and a small order of lumber she had arranged through the Buxton hardware store. The cell signal at the public dock was strong enough to take the call. Cora took the call, standing on the dock beside the borrowed pickup truck with the lumber in the bed. "Eileen," said Cora. "Aileen said I read about you." Cora did not say anything. Aileen said the Engelhard newspaper ran a story on the Lefebvre rescue. They put your name in. They identified you as the keeper of the Bodie Spit Sand Reef Station. The story has been picked up by the Outer Banks Sentinel. The Sentinel called the cottage in Raleigh yesterday. They asked me for a comment. Cora said, "What did you tell them?" Aileen said, "I told them I was proud of my sister." There was a long quiet on the line. Aileen said, "Cora, I would like to come down." Cora said the storm took the lantern housing off the back outbuilding. "I have not yet repaired the roof of the boathouse. The water tank needs replacing. I am working 2 days a week at the fish house and 3 days a week on the station." Aileen said, "I am not asking you to put me up." Aileen said, "I am asking if I can come down." Cora said, "When?" Aileen said, "This Saturday." Cora said, "All right." She let the silence sit on the line for another moment. She said, "Eileen." She said, "The skiff will be at the Hatteras Village landing at 9 in the morning." She hung up. Eileen drove down on the Saturday morning. She arrived at the Hatteras Village landing at 8:45. She was wearing jeans and a clean white blouse and a navy windbreaker she had bought new at a department store in Raleigh and had cut the tags off in the parking lot. She was carrying a small leather overnight bag in a paper sack from the bakery in Manteo with 2 cinnamon rolls and a pint of buttermilk. Cora ran the rented skiff up to the landing at 9. She had cleaned the skiff the evening before. She had wiped the hull. She had coiled the lines flat. She had made the small boat look the way her father had always made the Maureen B look on the morning of a Coast Guard inspection. Aileen stepped down into the skiff. The two sisters did not embrace. Cora ran the skiff back up the inside of the spit at three-quarter throttle. The morning was clear. The sound was glassy. A southwest breeze of about 6 knots was riffling the surface of the deeper water in long parallel lines. Cora did not speak during the run. Aileen sat on the forward thwart with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned into the wind, and she did not speak either. Cora tied the skiff up at the station landing dock at 10:12. She walked Aileen up the sand path to the station. Aileen stopped halfway up the path. She stopped at the rise where the path crested the dune, and the silver shingles and the square wooden tower came into view above the line of sea oats. She stood on the path for a long moment without speaking. The wind moved her hair out of her face. She had not been on a barrier island other than Hatteras since the family had taken the small ferry across to Ocracoke in the summer of 2009, when Aileen had been 10 and Cora had been 7 the year after their mother had died. Aileen said, "Cora." She said, "I did not understand." Cora did not answer. She walked Aileen the rest of the way to the station. She showed Aileen the iron signal flag locker. She did not yet show Aileen the gap behind the locker. She took Aileen back down the ladder, through the bunk room, down the staircase to the heavy wooden table in the crew quarters. She sat Aileen down at the table. She brought out the leather-bound logbook from the shelf above the fireplace where she had kept it since June. She opened the logbook to the page for the 30th of September, 1958. She read out loud in the morning light, coming through the narrow seaward windows, the final entry of Walter R. Hennessy Bosun's Mate Chief, United States Coast Guard. When she had finished reading the entry, she closed the logbook gently. She lifted the front cover. She slid the folded letter on cream paper out from where she had kept it since June. She unfolded the letter. She read Walter R. Hennessy's letter to her sister Aileen. Aileen sat very still at the heavy wooden table while Cora read the letter. When Cora reached the line, "I hope it is a person who knows the water," Aileen put her hand to her mouth. When Cora reached the closing line, "Keep the light," Aileen lowered her hand to the table. She placed her hand flat on the wood. She did not say anything. She did not move. Cora folded the letter. She placed it back inside the front cover of the logbook. She closed the logbook. She set the logbook on the heavy wooden table. The two sisters sat at the table in the quiet of the crew quarters for a long moment. Aileen said, "Cora." Aileen said, "I sold the cottage 36 hours after Dad died because I had to." Cora did not answer yet. Aileen said, "I had a deal go bad in Raleigh in the spring of 2024, a small commercial property on Wade Avenue. I had taken a personal stake in the deal because the partners told me it was a sure close. The deal collapsed in May. I lost $94,000 of my own money. I had borrowed 60 of that against my line of credit. I had not told Dad. I had not told you. I had told no one." Aileen said, "By November, when Dad died, I was 4 months behind on the line of credit, and the bank had begun the recovery process." Aileen said, "I called the broker in Nag's Head from my apartment in Raleigh on the morning after you called me about Dad. I called him because I needed the cottage to close in 60 days, or I was going to lose my apartment." Cora did not answer yet. Aileen said, "That does not excuse what I did." Aileen said, "I am not asking you to forgive me." Aileen said, "I am telling you because you are entitled to know." Cora sat at the table for a long time. She did not look at her sister. She looked out the narrow seaward window above the heavy wooden table. The Atlantic on the seaward side was a steady mid-morning blue. The wind was light. The breakers on the second bar were small. A single turn was working the wave line 100 yards out. Cora said, Eileen. Cora said, did you keep your apartment? Eileen said, I kept the apartment. I paid the line of credit. I am back to current. Cora said, are you still doing commercial real estate? Aileen said, yes. Cora said, do you know how to file a National Register of Historic Places nomination? Aileen looked up from the table. Aileen said, no, but I know how to learn. Cora slid the Coastal Heritage Resorts letter across the heavy wooden table to her sister. She said, learn fast. Eileen read the Coastal Heritage Resorts letter at the heavy wooden table in the crew quarters of the station for 19 minutes. She read it once at normal speed. She read it a second time with a pencil from the canvas sea bag in her hand, marking the easement language in the third paragraph. She read it a third time on the fourth paragraph, specifically where the offered $850,000 was conditioned on a closing within 30 days of the letter's date. She set the letter down. She said, Cora, she said this letter is a soft threat dressed up as a generous offer. Cora said, I know. Aileen said the easement on the sand road. They are telling you very politely that if you do not sell, they will challenge your access through the Department of Environmental Quality. Cora said, I know. Eileen said $850,000 is not the real number. The real number for what they are trying to assemble is closer to $2.5 million. They are offering $850 because they think you are 23 years old, and they think you do not have a lawyer, and they think you will be afraid of losing the road. Cora said the road floods every high tide. I do not need the road. I have the skiff. Aileen looked at her sister across the heavy wooden table. Eileen said, Cora. Aileen said that is exactly the point you should make on Tuesday morning to a maritime preservation attorney in Monteo. Cora said, I do not have a maritime preservation attorney. Eileen said, you do now. Her name is Eulalia Truitt. I worked across from her on a permitting case in Carteret County 18 months ago. She lost. She lost beautifully. She is 61 years old and she has been doing North Carolina coastal preservation law for 34 years, and she is the best loser I have ever met across a conference table because the cases she loses on the first round, she wins on appeal in the third round, and Coastal Heritage Resorts has not yet been put through the third round on a single one of their assemblage projects. Cora said, can you get her on the phone? Aileen said, give me an hour. Eileen got Eulalia Truitt on the phone in 53 minutes. The call took place in the signal room at the top of the tower because the signal room had the only cell signal on the property strong enough to hold a voice call for longer than 4 minutes. Eileen sat on the wooden floor of the signal room with her back against the eastern wall and her phone on speaker on her knee. Cora sat across from her with her back against the western wall. Eulalia Truitt was in Monteo. Eulalia Truitt had been having a quiet Saturday with a cup of coffee in the morning paper. Eulalia Truitt listened to the situation for 11 minutes without interrupting. When Eileen had finished the recitation, Eulalia Truitt said, Miss Brennan. Cora said, yes, ma'am. Eulalia Truitt said, do you have the original deed? Cora said, yes, ma'am. Eulalia Truitt said, do you have the original Coast Guard decommissioning paperwork from the September 1958 transfer of stewardship? Cora said, no, ma'am, but Mrs. Halligan at the clerk's office can pull it Monday morning. Eulalia Truitt said, do you have any structures or artifacts on the property that predate 1958 and that are demonstrably associated with the original life-saving service or Coast Guard operation? Cora said, yes, ma'am. I have the entire signal flag locker, an original heavy oak crew quarters table, an original brick fireplace, the original beadboard interior walls, the original bunk frames in the second floor surfmen's quarters, and the complete continuous logbook of the station from 1911 through the final entry on the 30th of September 1958. There was a pause on the phone. Eulalia Truitt said, "You have the logbook?" Cora said, "Yes, ma'am." Eulalia Truitt said, "The complete logbook." Cora said, "The complete logbook." 47 years, 341 rescue entries. Eulalia Truitt said, "That gives us 14 months to get you onto the Federal Register." Eulalia Truitt said, "Once you are on the Federal Register, Coastal Heritage Resorts will withdraw their offer because the development will no longer pencil." Cora said, "How much will all of this cost?" Eulalia Truitt said, "My retainer is $15,000. The Register nomination filings will cost another $4. Call it 20 by the time we file the federal in October." Cora said, "I have it." Eulalia Truitt said, "In the bank?" Cora said, "In the bank, from the cottage. I have not touched it since March." Eulalia Truitt said, "All right." Eulalia Truitt said, "Eileen." Aileen said, "Yes." Eulalia Truitt said, "You and your sister are going to drive up to my office on Monday morning at 10. I want every document she just listed to me on my conference table on Monday morning at 10. I want the deed, the decommissioning paperwork. Once Mrs. Halligan pulls it, the coastal heritage letter, and the logbook. I want the logbook in particular. I will start the state register filing on Tuesday afternoon." She paused. She said, "Miss Brennan," she said, "you are going to win this." Cora said, "Yes, ma'am." The list also contained one name that Cora had not expected. Eulalia Truitt had said on the way out the door that the most powerful single piece of evidence in any Maritime Historic Register nomination was the testimony of a living relative of the original keeper. She had said that the National Park Service Preservation Officer assigned to the federal nomination would assign double the documentary weight to a sworn affidavit from a direct descendant of Walter R. Hennessy. She had said that there was no way to file the federal nomination without at least an attempted contact with the Hennessy family. She had said, "Do you know where any of his people are?" Cora had said no. Eulalia Truitt had said, "Find out." Cora found out 3 weeks later. She found out through the United States Coast Guard Heritage Foundation in Elizabeth City. The foundation maintained in a quiet office on the second floor of the old district building a genealogical registry of all surviving direct descendants of every commissioned and chief-rated Coast Guard keeper who had served in the 5th District between the founding of the Life-Saving Service in 1871 and the consolidation of the inshore stations in 1958. The Foundation Registry listed one living direct descendant of Walter R. Hennessy. The descendant was named Desmond Hennessy. He was 70 years old. He'd been born in March of 1955. He was Walter R. Hennessy's grandson. His father had been Walter R. Hennessy's only son, a Coast Guard chief warrant officer named Carter Hennessy, who had served on the Coast Guard cutter Diligence between 1962 and 1989, and had retired in 1990 and had died of complications from heart surgery in 2007. Desmond Hennessy had himself served 26 years in the United States Coast Guard, retired as a senior chief in 2003, and had been living since then in a small house on the north side of Norfolk, Virginia. Cora wrote him a letter on the 2nd of October. She wrote the letter by hand at the heavy wooden table in the crew quarters of the station, with the leather-bound logbook open beside her, at the page for the 30th of September, 1958, and her father's brass ship's clock on the mantel above the fireplace, ticking quietly in the late afternoon light. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. The letter explained who she was and how she had come to own the station and what she had found behind the iron signal flag locker on the morning of the 7th of June. The letter explained the Federal Register nomination. The letter explained that there was a developer trying to take the station. The letter did not ask Desmond Hennessy for anything specifically. The letter said that the station would be open to him on any day he wished to come. The letter said that Cora believed his grandfather would have wanted him to see the place. She mailed the letter from the Hatteras Village post office on the 3rd of October. Desmond Hennessy wrote back 12 days later. His handwriting was the careful, forward-slanted hand of a man who had served 26 years in the United States Coast Guard. The same hand his grandfather had used in the final logbook entry of the 30th of September 1958. 67 years apart, the same hand. The letter said, Miss Brennan, I will come down on the 18th of October if that day is convenient. I will bring my grandfather's chief's cap. I have kept it on a shelf in my office since 1968. It is time it went back to the station. Desmond Hennessy came across the Sound on the rented skiff with Cora on the morning of the 18th of October. He was a tall man. He had white hair cut short in the way a senior chief cuts his hair. He had on khaki trousers and a navy windbreaker, and a pair of work boots that he had owned, he told Cora later, since 1992. He carried a small canvas duffel and a flat cardboard hat box. He stepped off the skiff onto the landing dock at 10 in the morning. He looked up the sand path to the station. He took off his ball cap. He stood on the landing dock for a long moment without saying anything. Cora did not rush him. When he was ready, he walked up the sand path to the station beside her. She showed him the ground floor crew quarters. She showed him the brick fireplace. She showed him the heavy wooden table. She showed him the narrow staircase. She showed him the bunk room on the second floor. She showed him the ladder to the signal room. She showed him the small square room at the top of the tower. She showed him the iron signal flag locker. She showed him, after she had walked him through the entire station, the gap behind the locker. She showed him the small wooden shelf. Desmond Hennessy did not speak during the entire tour. When Cora had finished showing him the shelf, she walked him back down the ladder, through the bunk room, down the narrow staircase to the heavy wooden table in the crew quarters. She sat him down at the table. She brought out the leather-bound logbook. She opened it to the page for the 30th of September 1958. Desmond Hennessy read the entry. He read it a second time. He read it a third time. Then he opened the small flat cardboard hat box he had carried across the Sound. Inside the hat box was a Coast Guard chief's combination cap from the early 1950s. The cap had a black leather visor that had cracked along the edge. The gold cord across the top of the visor had tarnished to a soft brown. The cap badge was the original 1955 pattern before the design change of 1957. Desmond Hennessy lifted his grandfather's chief's cap out of the hat box. He set the cap on the heavy wooden table beside the logbook. He said, Miss Brennan. He said my grandfather kept this cap on the desk in his office at the Elizabeth City District Headquarters from October of 1958 until his retirement in 1962. After he retired, he kept it on the mantel of his house in Edenton. After he died in 1981, my grandmother kept it on the same mantel until her death in 1994. After my grandmother died, my father kept it on the shelf in his office in Norfolk. After my father died in 2007, I kept it on the shelf in my office in Norfolk. He paused. He said, this cap has been off this island for 67 years. He said I would be obliged if you would keep it here from now on. Cora said, yes, sir. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. That afternoon on the wide-covered porch on the ocean side of the station, Cora and Aileen and Desmond Hennessy sat in 3 wooden chairs that Cora had repaired across the previous summer, with marine epoxy and oak dowels and brass screws she had ordered from a chandlery in New Bern. The chairs had been the 4 broken chairs in the corner of the crew quarters when Cora had first walked into the station in early June. She had spent 3 evenings in late August repairing them. They were sound now. they would last another 50 years. The afternoon was clear. A southwest breeze of about 8 knots was moving across the porch. The Atlantic was a steady October blue. A small pod of dolphins was working the line of the second sandbar. Desmond Hennessy said my grandfather would have liked this afternoon. Cora said yes, sir. Desmond Hennessy looked out at the line of the second sandbar. He said, you know there was a Brennan in his logbook. Cora said yes, sir. I read it. Desmond Hennessy said September of 1944. He pulled a sailor named T. Brennan out of a foundering schooner 2 miles southeast of this station at 3:40 in the morning. Cora said my great-grandfather, Todd Brennan. He had come over from County Kerry in 1921. He was 45 years old in September of 1944. Desmond Hennessy said your great-grandfather. Cora said yes, sir. Desmond Hennessy was quiet for a long moment. He said, so my grandfather pulled your great-grandfather out of the water in September of 1944. Cora said, yes, sir. Desmond Hennessy said, and your great-grandfather went on to have a son. Cora said, yes, sir. Cormac Brennan, my grandfather. He was born in 1942. Desmond Hennessy said, and Cormac had a son. Cora said, yes, sir. Fergus Brennan, my father. He was born in 1966. Desmond Hennessy said, and Fergus had 2 daughters. Cora said, yes, sir. My sister Aileen, and me. Desmond Hennessy did not speak for a long time. Then he said, my grandfather pulled 4 Brennans into existence on a September night in 1944. 4 people. 2 of them are sitting on this porch with me right now. Cora said, yes, sir. Desmond Hennessy said, that is a long line. Cora said, yes, sir. Desmond Hennessy turned his head slightly. He looked at Cora across the porch in the late afternoon light. The sun was going down behind the dune line. The Keeper blue was beginning to come into the eastern sky over the Atlantic, the way it had come in for Walter R. Hennessy on 6,422 evenings between June of 1941 and the 30th of September, 1958. Desmond Hennessy said, Miss Brennan. He said, you keep this light. Cora said, yes, sir, she did. Coastal Heritage Resorts withdrew their offer on the 17th of November. The withdrawal letter came in the same cream-colored letterhead. The signature line at the bottom was the same Penmount J. Whitfield. The third paragraph of the withdrawal letter cited the recent State Historic Register listing of the property and the related preliminary review by the Coastal Resources Commission. The fourth paragraph wished Cora well in her continued stewardship. Cora did not frame the withdrawal letter. She put it in the file folder Eulalia Truitt had set up for her in late August, and she put the file folder on the shelf above the fireplace beside the leather-bound logbook. She opened the station to the public on the second Saturday of December. The station opened as a small, free maritime heritage site, accessible by skiff or by the sand road at low tide. Open the second and fourth Saturdays of every month between April and November. School groups came from Hatteras and Ocracoke. Old fishermen came from Wanchese. 3 former Coast Guardsmen who had served at the Oregon Inlet Station in the 1970s came down on a Saturday in May. The grandson of one of Walter R. Hennessy's surfmen drove down from Norfolk in June and stood in the signal room for a long time and did not speak. Cora kept the green ledger of her grandmother Nora open on the heavy wooden table in the crew quarters, on the page Nora had last written on a Tuesday afternoon in January of 2015. She kept the chief's cap of Walter R. Hennessy on the mantel above the brick fireplace. She kept her father Fergus's brass ship's clock on the mantel beside the cap. She kept Togg's pocket knife on the mantel beside the clock. She kept the logbook on the heavy wooden table beneath the green ledger. The ocean was the specific deep blue black that the Atlantic turned off the outer banks at sunset in September. The keeper blue, the color the old keepers had watched for across 114 years of standing watch from the towers of the barrier islands. Cora thought about her father. She thought about her father who had taken her out on the Maureen B from the time she was 4 and had let her take the helm for the first time on a calm September afternoon in the Sound when she was 12, watching from the stern with his arms crossed and his ball cap pulled low, and the specific pride of a father who had just confirmed that his daughter's hands were the right hands for this work. She thought about her grandfather Cormac, who had mounted the brass ship's clock on the bulkhead of the family boat in 1978 and had wound it every Sunday morning for 23 years until the morning he could not wind it anymore. She thought about her great-grandfather Tog, who had come from County Kerry in 1921 with $11 in his pocket and the knowledge of how to read the water, and who had been pulled on a September night in 1944 out of a foundering schooner by a Coast Guard chief named Walter R. Hennessy, whose grandson had now sat on this porch with Cora in October of 2025 and had said, "That is a long line." She thought about her sister Eileen, who had driven down from Raleigh on the second Saturday of every month for 7 months of 2025, and who had filed the National Register nomination in October, and who had won the recreational easement modification in May of 2026 in front of the Coastal Resources Commission with the maritime preservation attorney Eulalia Truitt at her side and her own sister Cora as the lead historical witness. She thought about Walter R. Hennessy, who had stood watch on this station for 17 years and who had saved 341 human beings off the Atlantic, and who had, on the last evening of his service, sealed a logbook and a pouch of gold coins and a letter behind an iron signal flag locker on a barrier island, trusting that some person someday would reach behind the flags and find the shelf. That was the thing about the watches our fathers and our grandfathers and the men who had come before our grandfathers had kept. We did not always know when we were 4 years old, and standing on the deck of a working boat learning to coil a line, that the line was not the point. The point was the standing. The point was the being on the water at 4:30 in the morning when no one else in the world was on the water. The point was the being awake while the rest of the world was asleep. The point was the reading of a sky that had not yet decided what it was going to do. A watch was not a job. A watch was an agreement between a person and a stretch of water that the person would keep paying attention even when there was nothing to see. The old keepers had understood this. They had stood in towers on barrier islands for decades looking at an ocean that had been most nights empty and dark and indifferent. They had not stopped looking because the one night they had stopped looking would have been the one night a vessel went down within sight of the tower and there had been no one awake to see it. Our fathers had taught us this without using the word watch. They had taught us by waking us up at 4:30. They had taught us by letting us take the helm on calm afternoons in the Sound and then watching us from the stern without saying anything. They had taught us by hanging a brass clock on a bulkhead and winding it every Sunday morning for 23 years. And then years after they were gone, we climbed a ladder into a small square room at the top of a tower on a barrier island, and we reached behind an iron locker, and we found a letter from a man who had kept the same kind of watch our father had kept, and we understood finally that our father had not been teaching us to fish. Our father had been teaching us to stay awake. Cora Brennan had been 22 years old and she had been homeless, and she had had $10 to her name, and she had spent that $10 on an abandoned Coast Guard life-saving station on a barrier island off the coast of North Carolina. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story has stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. There is somebody in your life who has stood a watch of his own and who does not know that you saw him standing it. Tell him you saw. Tell him before the keeper blue comes in again. The light is still worth keeping. We will see you on the next quiet road.